Dear church, let's talk about suicide. Hello and welcome to the Dear Church podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley. I am privileged to be joined by my friend Steve Willis today. Steve is a member of our church at Oldham Lane, and I appreciate him so much being here. Also, licensed counselor, therapist, all those good things. And Steve, thank you so much for being with us. Why don't you, before we jump into this heavy topic, just tell us a little bit about yourself and, what brought you to Abilene and what you're doing in your professional life.
Okay. Well, I'm a former Air Force brat. My dad was in the Air Force for 20 years. And right after I got married, my wife and I moved to New York, and I was a missionary there.
Okay.
And got into so many marriage counseling situations that were way over my head. I decided to come and get a degree in marriage and family therapy. And we thought we were just going to be here in Abilene for 3 years, and now it's been 30-something years.
Just come and get your degree and go somewhere else.
Right. And so I'm a therapist at Turning Point Counseling Center, a hypnotherapist, and what's called an EMDR therapist. Work with trauma, anxiety disorders, and I'm also an adjunct professor at ACU in the marriage and family therapy program.
So hypnotherapy. So I bet that would be interesting to watch.
It's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and get good results from that.
Yes.
What would be a reason to do hypnotherapy?
Oh, there's all kinds. Dealing with trauma.
Okay.
Dealing with habits, phobias.
Okay.
Things like that.
So, our topic today: someone who's grieving the trauma of losing someone to suicide. Would that be a case where you might use hypnotherapy?
Yes.
Yeah.
Usually what is called age progression. You've heard of age regression, taking someone into the past, but age progression is like taking yourself a year from now.
Yeah.
When things are going better, you're still sad, you're still grieving, but at the same time, you're doing better.
Okay.
And from that vantage point, so I'll talk, now it's end of April 2021, all of the presidential things are done with, and you're glad of that. And then what, where are you a year from now, so that they kind of have a perspective, and then have them look back to the last week of April, first week of May, and what were some things that they did that got them there?
Okay.
It's a real neat kind of approach.
So you're trying to get them to look past the grief in the moment and look towards what it's going to be like in the future. Is that
not minimize the grief, but realize that things. It's realize that things are going to get better and that they will be in a different place in a year. But it's not telling them, well, you'll feel better in a year. It's letting their mind kind of project that.
Kind of cope with it better.
Yeah.
And, we've called this podcast series, Good Grief, and we certainly don't mean that grief is good, but it can have a good result. I think grieving is natural, it's necessary. I think it's an important part of the healing process and finding closure. When do you see that grieving is no longer natural? When it's maybe where grieving is not helping as much as it is hurting, if that's a way to put it. Is there a timeline? Is there a time frame when somebody should be getting better?
No. Not a specific timeline. Each person's going to be unique in how much time they need to grieve, how they grieve. A lot of it has to do with their temperament, their personality, their attachment to the person that they're grieving about. And so you don't put a timeline. I think of when we lived in New York, there was a man across the street who was a Jordanian Catholic, and I'd never seen the grief process there. And they have a very specific grief process. The wailing over the loss of the person, a specific year given to the grieving, visiting the grave, the day of the burial, 3 days after, 1 week after, 2 weeks after, 1 month after, 3 months after, 6 months after, and then and wearing black all during that time. And then they have a wedding.
Really?
1 year later. He was a Klan leader, and so that with us, a lot of times in America, we figure, well, there's nothing I can do. Work will give us like 3 days, if it's someone real close to us.
Right.
So both of those are probably kind of extreme.
Right. Yeah, so they had more of a ritual to it,
right.
And kind of spelled it out. Where we look at grief, and the funeral comes, and then you should be over it. That's the closure, and you get back to work, you get back to life, and life's tough. Wear a helmet, and quit worrying about it, and quit crying all the time, and start to infuse yourself back into society. But
we have a tendency to bury it.
We do,
which is not healthy. They try to squeeze every bit of grief out of it, and so there is a lot of wisdom in that.
I imagine you see a lot of folks that have suppressed their grief, and maybe that's what's brought them to you, is the fact that they have not dealt with it in a healthy manner. What are some healthy ways to deal with this grief?
Well, one of the things that I suggest to people is to have to plan somewhere in the future, and usually a year later, a ceremony.
Okay.
To be, because usually, it's hard enough when you lose someone, but you're still in shock when that happens.
Right.
And a year later is when really a lot of the pain hits you. And
really?
So I tell people that a lot of times the year later is going to be the hardest.
Really? Okay.
And so I help them plan, or I let them plan by themselves a ceremony, honoring them. It can be something like a party, with pictures or something, inviting people over, writing notes to the person who's deceased, and tying them to Mylar balloons and letting them and releasing them. Whatever they think, they've come up with a lot of unique ways, but it gives them, one, they're honoring the person. They're not just trying to, push on, so it's something that's I think a necessary thing.
So when we talk about suicide, I have said, as a minister and in doing some counseling myself in these situations, suicide is a grief like no other. I really feel like it's kind of in its own category. Let me ask you this: how is it different? What do you see when counseling folks that have dealt with the loss of a child to suicide, or a spouse or a family member? How is it different? I have my ideas, but I want to hear from you. How do you think it's different than all other grief?
Well, because of the guilt. A lot of times a person hasn't noticed what they were going through.
Sure.
The person who suicided. Sometimes the person who died really wanted to produce some pain. You can kind of tell how a person, kind of where they were by the way they take their life.
Yeah.
A person who, overdoses on medication is oftentimes very sad and just wants to leave. A lot of times it's accidental. Some suicides weren't meant to. It was to make a statement, or they were feeling low, and then it was too late after they did that. But if there is like shooting, something that is violent, something that is messy, usually it's much more anger that the person is expressing in there. And that's much more likely to come out in males, especially teenagers, than in girls. But every so often you'll see that with girls. And so that's one of the issues. And then also the effect that it has on a marriage. Whenever there's a death of a child, marriages have a very high chance of falling apart.
Yes.
And then there's the imitation. It's very, very common. When we lived in New York at White Plains High School, there was a boy who committed suicide in the bathroom. A few days later, his girlfriend committed suicide. And then it was like a domino effect of people, several. At the time, they called it the White Plains Syndrome. Yeah. And so that's another danger in that, and ignoring it or pretending it's not there can oftentimes lead to more deaths, even of parents who feel a lot of guilt.
So you said something there that it's kind of striking. I'd not heard that the form in which they take to end their life oftentimes says something about where they're at.
Right.
And also that that the intent is not always just to remove myself from the equation, so to speak, and just to end it all, but also maybe to inflict pain, which it obviously does. I've said that one of the things with suicide that makes it very difficult is because everyone else is left to pick up the pieces, and there's a lot of why questions. Why didn't I see this coming? Why didn't I pick up on the signs or the symptoms? Why did they do it this way? I know sometimes if a note is left, that helps folks deal with it a little bit better, but still it's a grief like no other because, if a child or a spouse or a loved one is taken away from you accidentally or through natural causes, we almost understand that as kind of a part of life, a routine part of life. But when someone takes their own life, it really is a pain that sticks with us for a lot longer and lingers. I don't know if you ever truly get over the loss of a loved one anyway, but it definitely is one that lingers because you're left to pick up the pieces and to kind of put this all together. And then you add the if you're a Christian, you read the Bible, you understand that murder, therefore self-murder is sin. And so then you wonder about the eternal state of their soul. Of course, like we've talked about in a previous episode of this podcast, is that a lot of factors go into that. I don't think we can draw a clear line of demarcation and say, kill yourself, you go to hell, that kind of thing, because, a lot of times there's medications we take that alter our chemistry in our brain that, a lot of times there's some other factors going on that maybe we couldn't overcome. So I don't think that's a clear, black and white issue. But all those things factor in. It makes it very difficult to move forward. Right. And I guess you've seen those kind of things and, seen the lingering effects of this. What kind of advice do you give?
Well, especially because a lot of people have heard that it's, it's like killing, that the person is lost. And what I usually go to a Bible verse, and I will talk to them about Samson.
Yes.
In Hebrews, it lists Samson as one of the people of faith who's going to share in the salvation that comes through Christ. And he committed suicide.
Yes.
A kind of suicide most of us would not be able to pull off, but pull a building down on yourself is, and yet he is listed as one of those people of faith. So that kind of statement is, I remember one time when I was in school, one of the students committed suicide. I was going to a school of preaching where, Ed Myers, who was one of your teachers, taught at that time. And one of the students, his wife left him, and he shot himself in the backyard of his parents' house. He had gone back to try to convince her to come back with him to school. And I remember one of our teachers said, don't you be putting him in hell. You don't know what he was going through.
Yeah,
and
that's a good point.
And I think that's an important. When I do therapy with people, I tell a lot of stories. I give a lot of examples. That's, I think, a helpful thing for them to realize other people have gone through similar things. But I also, they oftentimes will come up with things like, well, I know other people have had it worse than me, and I say that doesn't matter. Yeah. I use the illustration of a cup. I said there is only, a cup is how much we can, when it comes to stress and anxiety, that we can, let's say it's a 24-ounce cup or something like that. That's all that we can comprehend. Anything that goes over the top of that, if it just comes up to the rim, or if there's a Olympic-sized swimming pool being poured into it, you still can't comprehend any more than that. And so comparing your suffering to someone else's is not a helpful thing, because you had it filled up to the top, all you could comprehend. And also, never do I say, I know how you feel, because I do not know how to feel. Even if I had lost someone to suicide, I don't know how another person feels.
Yeah, it doesn't cross over. You know, there's each situation seems to be unique. Like you said a while ago, every individual griever is different, and how they handle the grief is different. You know, we say things like time heals all wounds, and I think to some degree there's some truth to that, but at the same time, it doesn't completely heal all wounds for everybody. You know, it may make it easier to deal with it over time, but I think you're going to deal with the effects of. I know of people who lost a child 30 years ago and they're still not over it.
Yeah,
I mean,
you always have the scars.
You always have those scars, and then when they took their own life, it's even more difficult. Is there a point to this that, like, especially with teenagers, with younger individuals, where their frontal lobe isn't fully developed and all that? Is there maybe a side to this where they're not thinking about the permanence of it? Someone that's younger that commits suicide, that maybe, they're just thinking in the moment and they haven't really thought through. And, like you said a while ago, sometimes it's accidental. Maybe it's not accidental, their intent, but they didn't really consider all of that. I mean, that would play to what we've been talking about, as well as, what the gentleman said, don't you put him in hell. I think there's something to be said for the fact that maybe as teenagers, you're not always thinking this through, Well,
the brain is not developed, and I tell people, sometimes people are insulted by this, but you still have a teenager brain until you're 25.
Yeah.
Even before they did brain scans and realized that insurance actuaries knew that something changed at 25, and especially males, and why that's why their insurance went down at that time. So you're much more emotionally, it's kind of like you have the thinking and considering part of your brain, but you also have your emotions. You have the emotion first, and then the other part of your brain rationalizes your emotion.
Okay.
And instead of, as an adult, or hopefully as an adult, we make the decisions and we consider the emotions, but we don't let that rule us. And so I think that in dealing with a teenager, yes, there's going to be times when just spur of the moment. There's some who plan this for a long time. A lot of times, people don't realize this, but when you're depressed and you're real low in energy, you're very unlikely to commit suicide.
Yeah.
Because it takes some energy. A lot of times when a person is coming out of depression, getting better, maybe they've been put on some medication or something, they're more at risk at that time than, the MMPI test will oftentimes, like if a person's depression.
So what is MMPI?
Okay. It's a Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. It's a 600 question test, that tests all kinds of psychological problems. And if your energy level is high and your depression is high, then you're at risk.
Okay.
But if your energy level is low and your depression is very high, you're not at much of a risk.
Right.
So,
what do you say to somebody if you've had this opportunity to speak to someone who's contemplating suicide? Have you had that situation? So what do you say to someone who has seriously thought about it and sees that as a viable option to deal with the pain that they're dealing with?
Okay. Well, the first thing is I don't give them a lot of sayings, that it's a permanent answer to a temporary problem or any of those little bumper sticker kind of answers or memes that people use. What's most important at that time is just to listen and let them talk about, if they have a plan, what the plan is.
Sure.
Because that's a lot of times the problem is no one's been listening to them.
Yeah. Okay.
And no one lets them talk the whole thing out. So they haven't really reasoned through it.
Yeah.
So just being there with a person and not feeling like you've got to give a bunch of answers is the first thing to do.
Yeah. Do you notice a common thread with folks that you counsel with that are contemplating suicide? Is there, like you said, that they may not have been listened to or been able to feel like they could express themselves? Have you noticed other common threads with people who come in that have contemplated suicide? Is there something that really kind of stands out to say this is, across the board, something that I see?
There's so many different reasons why people commit suicide. It can be like the loss of a relationship, failure in school if they're in a teenager in college.
Sure.
When I was in school, I did not make very good grades, and I was at the University of Texas, and people, they would close down the tower during finals because people would jump off of it. Really? And I was talking to a friend of mine, and he said, "Yeah, I've thought about that." And I said, "You make, like what? Like you got a B or something like that? You're depressed?" He said, "Well, yeah, I think about it. I'd never thought about it." And there's some people who never think about suicide. Yeah. Maybe it's because I'm self-centered or don't. But there's some people that it just seems to be in their mind. And there's one theory that this comes from very, very early in life, like from childhood, that children will think of one of two ways. One is, I wish I wasn't here, or two, I wish other people weren't here. Yeah. When you look at Home Alone, for example, the movie Home Alone, Kevin. Kevin is someone who would very, very unlikely to ever suicide because he wishes that his family wasn't there. Right. But it's almost like there's an obsession, like I wish I could leave. And that's a person who's much more likely to suicide. Yeah. Yeah, I think it when talking about this issue, and definitely when talking to families who have lost a loved one, my mother, for instance, found her best friend who had killed herself. My mother was the one who found her body, and that's an image that is ingrained in your mind that you've never. I know my mother never got that out of her mind, and of course, obviously made worse because it was her best friend. And I remember my mom talking about the collateral damage. She said, I loved my best friend, Sharon was her name. She said, I loved Sharon, and she never came and talked to me about it. She just did this without thinking about, me and how this would affect me. And, at first I thought, well, that's kind of selfish. You bringing yourself into this conversation. But what my mother was saying, I think, was that there's the collateral damage involved in this. And like we said a while ago, the rest of us are left here to pick up the pieces and try to figure out how to move forward. Would you agree with that? Yes. There's a lot of collateral damage that I'm sure you've had to sort out when talking with somebody. So where's the hope in all that? I know that one of your major goals in counseling with someone is to help them to cope better with their grief. Where's the hope in all this? Where do you find that? Well, like in therapy, one of the things that is kind of a necessary thing is to be able to separate from it, to look at it in a different way. And there's a lot of different approaches to that. One, hypnosis, it's called dissociating from something, where you, for example, like someone who experienced what your mother did, you might take them back as an adult, as they are now, back to that scene. Yeah, and watch that younger them going through that, and then comfort her and bring her out of that memory. I usually use a train ride for that. And so, and people will come back and it's like now they look at it differently. They don't look at it, what's associated is looking through your own eyes, remembering something through your own eyes. Right. Dissociated is seeing yourself going through it, and it immediately changes it. Another kind of therapy that I do is called EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. Okay. And it does a similar thing using both sides of the brain. And the goal is to get the person, how distressed they are, get them down to a zero distress. That's absolute. And it's amazing how someone go through some terrible trauma like that.
Yeah.
And they'll say, I don't feel that feeling in my stomach or my chest or my head that I did before. They remember it. It's still in their brain, but it's been kind of changed around. So there's a lot of different approaches, but they have to realize they're not still in that memory.
And how about the guilt? I mean, I'm sure you have folks that come in, like parents, that feel guilty, that maybe we didn't show enough love. Maybe we didn't, always listen like we should have. Maybe we were too overbearing. How do you help folks deal with that baggage?
Well, let them certainly talk about that. You don't go there. That's not a helpful thing. They need to go there. They need to talk about it and talk it out. But also, they need to realize, like, if there's other children in their family, their spouse, their friends, to eventually get to living life, and to realize that yes, there is a time for grief, but don't neglect the other.
Because the collateral damage that could be involved is neglecting, your marriage. Michael Whitworth was on here a couple of weeks ago to talk about the loss of his a small child. And he said that something like 70% of marriages dissolve after the loss of a child. And we talked about that. I said, why, all that. And he said, well, things get drug up that, maybe have been on the back burner or never really talked about. And, you tend to lash out and you tend to take out your anger on the person closest to you. So that's part of that coping with the collateral damage of it all. That
as you're trying to think about why it happened, you'll start out by kind of thinking on yourself. What did I do that might have hurt them? But that's not a fun thing to look at. Right. And so then you start looking at, what did my spouse do? Sure. They were always hard on him or her, or the child, or it's like finding someone to blame instead of just dealing with the grief.
Does it concern you that recently we've had some television programs that, especially that were teen focused, talking about this topic and almost glorifying it? Does it concern you? I mean, there are some cultures even that glorify this. While we don't want to place people in hell, every person that's committed suicide, we also don't want to present it as a viable option. Yeah. And was it, I may be speaking out of turn here, 13 Ways to Die, was that the television program that took a lot of heat because it was glorifying suicide? That's got to be concerning, doesn't it? I mean, we don't want somebody to feel like this is a viable option, right?
Yeah. But yes, and a lot of times because it will attract interest, TV programs will put that up and all that. One thing, just as kind of an aside, when it comes to, like, a lot of times people see cutting or self-injury as the same as suicide. And one of the things that when I talk, there's a lot of teenagers that do that. Yeah. And what I'll tell people, and especially the teenagers when they come in, is that this is, I'm not going to overly focus on that. Certainly I would like for you not to be cutting yourself, but a lot of times that's a coping mechanism. When a person cuts themselves or injures themselves, it releases endorphins, and because the endorphins, they feel better. Okay. So I try to help them to feel better in different ways than that. But a lot of times there'll be this just kind of over concern. Certainly, a parent needs to talk to a child when they're doing that, and but they don't need to. That's not the focus. That's not the problem. There's something behind it. Why they're hurting.
There's always something deeper.
Yeah.
So you're saying that the cutting doesn't necessarily lead to suicide.
No.
Yeah. In fact, they can be two very distinct and separate. So
Right.
so what are some signs to look for? If your loved one, if you're concerned, or if you're a parent, we don't want to be overreactive, but what are some things to look for? What are some signs that maybe are there?
Well, a lot of times, like especially a good student whose grades suddenly drop drastically, someone who has been depressed and suddenly just seems very, very perky. A lot of times there's kind of a euphoria once a person has decided that they're
I would not have guessed that.
Yeah. And that's why so many people are surprised. Inability to sleep.
Okay.
I had one client who he'd gone to just about every sleep clinic in the United States and took his life because he was just so tired. He could not sleep.
Yeah.
And then one of the big tip-offs is if they start giving away valuable things that are valuable to them.
Really? Okay.
That's been one of the kind of tip-offs for a long, long time.
Yeah.
They want someone else to have this thing that meant a lot to them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Do you counsel with a lot of folks where a note was left or there was some reason given, or is it the other way around where it was just completely out of the blue and shock and all that?
Well, the ones that I think back on, there was no note.
Okay.
It was more spur of the moment.
Yeah.
I've counseled with teenagers who, one Wednesday night, I got a call from a mother and her two children were really, really upset. They had just, their best friend had just taken his life. They had just heard about it at a youth conference. And so I met them over at my office and we talked, and there was no indication, that they could tell beforehand. It was a spur of the moment. I counseled another person who's he broke up with his girlfriend, and she took her life that afternoon.
Wow.
And and so he was quite unpopular with all of her friends. I guess it's just with me, I haven't had any clients that I can think of that
you don't see one more than the other.
No.
Yeah. It's just more of a reactive thing, it sounds like, as much as anything. And I think it's important for us. I started to say Christians, but non-Christians alike. I think it's important for us to reserve our judgments. I think we so often survey a situation where there's been a suicide and we say, oh, well, what did those parents do or not do? Or, what did their family do or not do? And we don't need to be in that business. That's not up to us. There's so many factors that go into this. And like you said, there's so many different situations. And I think that obviously leads to the guilt with a lot of people and the shame that comes with that. But I mean, there are plenty of folks out there as parents, as friends, as family members who have done everything right, or at least were perfectly normal in the way that they handled the family relationships and all that. And yet this happens. It's not a testament to something you did wrong necessarily. It's also not a testament to, how you could have done something better necessarily. It's a personal decision that's made that unfortunately, brings collateral damage.
And if in the process you learn that there was something, like maybe they did leave a note and they did explain why, and it was your fault, you played a part in it, to change because of that. Don't get just caught up in the grief. Use that as an opportunity.
Yeah. Stephen, tell us again where you're located, the name of your of the counseling center that you're at, and I also want folks to know that they can contact me. We always have the the option where people can send in questions or comments. If you have a question for Stephen, we can certainly pass that along to him. But it's Turning Point. Is it
Turning Point Counseling, 500 Chestnut, the 10th floor.
Okay.
So if you have a fear of elevators, we can work on that.
That's part of it.
Yes, and I have.
Yes.
Well, we got a good place to test your elevator phobias.
Yes, gotcha.
So it's 325-437-1001.
Okay. And if you have a question, as I said, for me or for Stephen, we'll make sure that they get that. I understand that, folks may be tuning in that are dealing with this situation very closely, and we want to help you as much as possible. If you're someone who has contemplated suicide and you've thought about that as an option, please, please, please reach out to me, to Stephen, and we will certainly help you. If you're not in the Abilene area, still reach out, but reach out to somebody closer to you, and we want to help you as much as possible. We thank you so much for tuning in today. Stephen, I want to thank you so much for being here and taking time out of your schedule to come, and great information that I hope will be beneficial to so many. And I want to thank all of y'all for tuning in. If you would share about the podcast, we're on iTunes, Spotify, Facebook, YouTube, and we just thank you so much for being with us today. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.